We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faizan. Act 1. Silver as a Crescent Moon. Chapter 1. People lived because she killed, and if that meant braving the hours from even the sun was afraid to glimpse, then so be it. On the occasional good days, Zafira bint Iskandar mused that she was braver than the sun itself. Most days she couldn't wait until the evernight hours was behind her and she was firmly rooted in the plans of her caliphate, Dama, snow and all. Today was one of those days, despite the antler rough against her hands. She stepped free of the cursed prison of a forest, pretending her sigh was due to her task being complete, rather than a product of tightly coiled fear unwinding in her heart. The morning sun kissed her cheeks in welcome. Marhaba to you, too, coward. Sunlight was always faint in the caliphate of Demenher, because the sun didn't know what to do with the snow that should be sand. Before her, the sea of white rolled out smooth and pristine, gifting her a moment's contentment in her solitude, even as her toes numbed and the air crippled her nose, for in the caliphate where a woman's actions were always in danger of being turned against her, there was nothing easy about pretending to be a man. Not when she had the curves of a woman and the voice and gait of one too. She dragged the deer carcass along, a trail of stream in her wake, the sullied snow an eerie crimson. There was a promise in the air, a stillness in the earth and in the whispering trees. It's nothing. Paranoia had a way of visiting women when he least desired. She was a handle of emotions because of its impending wedding, that was all. Sakar nickered from the rotting post where she had tethered him, blending in with her near white coat, while she made quick work of tying the deer to her stallion's saddle. He remained still, as sweet as the name she had given him. "We had a good hunt today," she said to the horse who hadn't helped and swung onto its back. Sakar didn't react, content with staring across the distance into the hours as if an ifrit would leap out and swallow him whole. "Dastard," Safira said, a smile on her numbing lips. Though everyone was a coward when it came to the forest, each of the 5 caliphates that made up Arawiya was afraid of the Ars, for it rimmed those lands too. It was a curse they share ever since the land had been robbed of magic. Baba had taught Safira that the Ars was, in many ways, simply a forest. He had taught her ways to use it to her benefit, ways to believe she could tame it, where in reality she could not. No one could. His death had proved as much. Zafira steered Sakar away from the forest, toward the clearing and deeper in Demenher. When the Ars was such that it always demanded one last glimpse, she paused and turned. It watched, breathed. Its skeleton trees reached with gnarled fingers steeped in swirling shadow. Some said it devoured men like vultures on the dead, yet Zafira returned day after day, hunt after hunt. She was aware each vulture could be her last, and though she swore she didn't fear much, finding herself lost was her biggest fear of all. Still, there was a pulse deep inside her that relished those visits into the depths of darkness. She hated the Ars. She hated it so much she craved it. "Ah, plenty of time to stare at the Ars every damn a day," she said to Sakar, a quiver to her voice. "We need to get back for the wedding, or Yasmin will have our heads." Not that Sakar cared. Zafira clucked her tongue and urged him forward. The tension escaped his taut muscles as the distance between them and the Ars grew, until the air heavied with another presence. The small hairs on her nape of her neck lifted, and she threw a very wary glance over her shoulder. The Ars stared back, as if with bated breath. No, whoever it was stood here in Demenher, imitating the silence almost as well as she did. Almost. If there was one thing she feared more than losing herself within the Ars, it was being caught unaware by a man who could prove she was no longer a hunter, but a huntress. If there was one thing she feared more than losing herself within the Ars, it was being caught unaware by a man who could prove she was no hunter, but a huntress. A girl of 17, concealed beneath the weight of her father's hooded cloak every time she hunted. Then she would be shunned, her victories derided, her identity viciously unraveled. The thought closed hands around her heart, the thud, thud, thud racing a little bit faster. She spun Sakkar to face the Ars, kicking against the strains of his hesitation as the low command drifted on the wind, words undecipherable. Yalla, she urged him to hurry, voice tight. He shook out his name and cantered forward without protest. The air darkened as they neared the forest. Funny, Zafira was heading toward the unknown at the first sight of mortal danger. The cold bit at her face, a blur of black sped from her right, a second blur from her left. Horses. She bit her lip and swerved Sakkar between them, ducking with something swung from her head. Kif! Someone yelled, but what kind of idiot would stop? Sakkar, he froze at the border of the Ars and Zafira jerked into her saddle, a slap, reminding her that he had never ventured this close. Wood and sour decay assaulted her cold senses. La, not now, you dastard, she hissed. Sakkar threw his head but didn't budge. Zafira stared into the hushed darkness and her breath faltered. The Ars wasn't a simple place to turn one's back to. It wasn't a place to be caught unaware and unsuspecting, and, with a curse, she veered Sakkar around, despite his protests. The wind howled cold and harsh. She was painfully aware of the Ars breathing down her neck, until she took in the two horses, snorting a mere 4 paces away. Coats dark as the night sky, powerful bodies cloaked in chainmail, war horses. Bred in one place alone, the neighbor caliphate of Saracen. Or possibly Sultan's keep, it was hard to tell which, when Arawiya's Sultan had recently murdered Saracen's caliph in cold blood. Unlawfully seizing control of land and armies, the Sultan had no need for, not when Arawiya rested under his control, and not when he had the Sultan's guard on his back and call. The caliphs existed for balance. He wasn't supposed to kill them. Atop their horses, the men bare arms were corded with muscle, faces cut with harsh lines. They were the color of people who knew life beneath the sun, the ebb and flow of the desert Zafira longed for. Yallah, hunter, the large man said, as if she were cattle to be herded. Her eyes fell to the scimitar in his grasp. If Zafira had any doubts on where they were from, the timbre of his voice was enough. Her throat closed in on itself. Being tracked by gossiping Demenhun was one thing, being attacked by Saracens was another. She lowered her head so that her hood obscured more of her face. She braved the darkness. She slew rabbits and deer. She had never stood before a blade. But for all their might, the men held their distance. Even they were afraid of the Ars. Zafira lifted her chin. Whatever for, she drawled over the sudden hiss of the wind. She had people to feed and a bride as beautiful as the moon to say goodbye to. Why me? To meet the Sultan, the smaller man said. The Sultan? Skies. The man had shorn more fingers and hands than hair from his head. People said he had been a good one, but Zafira found that hard to believe. He was Saracen by birth, and Saracens, she had been told all her life, were born without a shred of good in their hearts. Panic flared in her chest again, but she lowered her voice. If the Sultan wanted to see me, he would respect with a letter, not his hounds. I am no criminal. The small man opened his mouth upon being likened to a dog, but the other shifted his blade and drew closer. This isn't a request. A pause, as if he realized his fear of the Ars wouldn't allow him to move any farther. And then... Yallah, come forward. No. There had been a way out. Zafira paused her lips in realization. If there was one thing other than barbarian Saracens were known for, it was pride. She whispered sweet nothings to Sakkar. Maybe it was the men, or maybe it was the war horses, mighty and intimidating, but her loyal horse took a step back. It was the closest he had ever gone to the Ars, and Zafira was going to torture him with much more. She gave the men a crooked smile, her lips cracked and likely colorless from the cloud. Come and fetch me. You have nowhere to go. You forget Saracen. The Ars is my second home. She stroked Sakkar's mane, steeled her heart, and steered him into the dark. It swallowed her whole. She tried not to acknowledge the way it welcomed her, elated whispers brushing her ears. a surge in her bloodstream, hunger in her veins. Dark trees stood eerie and unyielding, leaves sharp and glinting. Distantly, she heard the gallop of horses as the Saracens shouted and followed. Vines crunched beneath Sakar's hooves, and Zafira's sigh fell to near blindness. Except for his panicked breath, Sakar was mercifully quiet as Zafira listened for the men, her own heart echoing thud. Despite their fear, they had followed, for pride was a dangerous thing. Yet only silence drummed at her ears, like the moment after a blade's unsheathing, the halt after the first howl of wind. They were gone. For once she appreciated the fearsome, incalculable strangeness of the Ars that made the men disappear. The two Saracens could be leagues away, and neither she nor they would ever know it. Such was the Ars. This was why so many people who entered never returned. They couldn't find their way back. A soft hiss sounded from the east, and she and Sakar froze. She could see little of his white coat, but years of returning again and again had sharpened her hearing better than any blade. She saw with her ears in the Ars. Footsteps echoed, and the temperature careened downward. "Time to go home," Zafira murmured, and Sakar shivered as he edged forward, guided by her hand, by the rushing whisper in her heart, sated only when she moved. The darkness ebbed away to a soft blue sky and the distant throb of the sun. At once she felt a yawning emptiness as the cold stung her nostrils, scented with metal and a hint of amber. The Saracens, it seemed, hadn't been so lucky. How long ago had the three of them ridden into the Ars? It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, but the position of the sun claimed it had been at least an hour. Zafira didn't want to know whether the Sultan had really sent for her, or, if so, why. It was the why that caused Sakar to snort beneath her everywhere, one thing at a time, he seemed to say. When the war horses had stood, the snow was now smooth, and she yanked on Sakar's reins. A woman stood against the plains of white. A heavy cloak of grey, no, shimmering silver, sat on her slender shoulders, above a sweeping red gown. Her raised hood barely covered the top of her stark hair, as white as snow. Her lips were crimson, a curse of blood. Zafira swore the woman hadn't been there a moment ago. A gallop began in her chest. The Ars depraves an idle mind. "Who knew you could kill so swiftly?" the woman said in a voice of silk. Did the Ars conjure voices to its illusions too? "I am no assassin. I only evaded them," Zafira said, realizing a beat later that she shouldn't respond to an illusion. She hadn't killed those men, had she? Clever. The woman smiled after a pause. "You truly do emerge sane and in one piece." A gust below her cloak. Her dark eyes drifted across the first line of the Ars trees with an odd mix of awe and sky's adoration. The woman wavered and solidified, real and not. "It's a lot like Shar, isn't it?" Then she shook her head, every movement deliberate. Fear simmered beneath Zafira's skin at the mention of Shar. "Oh, how could I ask such a tease of a question?" and she continued. "You haven't been to the island yet." "Are you real?" Zafira wanted to ask. She demanded instead, "Who are you?" The woman fixed her with that glittering gaze, bare hands clasped. Did she not feel the sting of the cold? Zafira tightened her fingers and on Sakar's reins. "Tell me, why do you hunt?" "For my people, to feed them," Zafira said. Her back ached and the deer was beginning to smell. The woman clucked her tongue with a slight frown and Sakar trembled. No one can be that pure. Zafira must have blinked, for that woman was suddenly closer. Another blink despite her best efforts, and the woman had moved away again. "Do you hear the roar of the lion? Do you hear its call? Where did this loon call from?" "The tavern is in the souk if you're looking for more arak." But Zafira's usual candor was hindered by the tightening in her throat. The woman laughed, a tinkling that stilled the air. Then Zafira's vision wavered, and the snow was suddenly clothed in shadow. Black bled into white, tendrils reaching for Zafira's ankles. "Dear Huntress, a woman like me has no need for drink." "Huntress." The reins slipped from Zafira's hands. "How—" The words died on her tongue. A smile twisted the woman's lips, and with it Zafira's heart. It was the type of smile that meant she knew Zafira's secrets. The type of smile that meant no one was safe. "You will always find your way, Zafira bint Iskandar," the woman said. She sounded almost sad, though the glint in her eyes was anything but. Lost, you should have remained, cursed child. The silver of her cloak flashed when she turned, and then Zafira must have blinked again, because the woman had vanished. Zafira's heart clambered to her throat. Her name, that smile. There was no sign of bleeding black on the silver cloak now. The snow was pristine as the claws in her brain loosened. Then Sakar was off before she could regain her hold on the reins. She fumbled with a shout, sitting tall to keep from tumbling to the snow. She continued on a mad dash until they crested the slope and stumbled to a stop. Zafira jerked back, cursing until Sakar ducked his head with a dignified snort. Breathe. Assess. She looked back at the Evernight forest once more, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. It was almost as if Zafira had imagined the whole encounter. Perhaps she had. Zafira knew the Ars better than most, which was to say she understood that no one could ever know its secrets. To trust in its wickedness was to court a tortured death. Do you hear the roar of the lion? It wasn't a roar Zafira heard. Something else beckoned from the darkness, enticing her, growing with her every visit. It was as if a thread of her heart had snagged into the forest and was trying to reel her back in. She drew in a sharp breath. Exhaustion had conjured the woman, that was all, and now she was late. She veered Sakar around with a huff. She veered Sakar around with a huff. She had a dress to don and a wedding to catch.